In this dramatized royal scenario, the room went silent when Catherine placed the unsigned document in front of Camilla and said 6 words nobody expected her to say. "The delay ends here. I've approved it." Camilla didn't look at the signature. She looked at Charles, because only the king was supposed to make that decision. Charles stayed completely still. No objection, no command to remove the document, not even a glance toward the private secretary standing by the door. That was when Camilla realized something far worse had happened. Catherine hadn't taken the decision away from Charles. Charles had waited so long that the decision had legally slipped beyond his control. But the document on the table wasn't about Catherine. It wasn't even about William. The name written beneath the final clause belonged to the one royal Camilla believed had already been pushed safely out of the argument: Prince Edward. And what Edward was about to receive would force everyone in that room to confront a promise Charles had spent months refusing to discuss. The trouble had started 11 days earlier, though nobody understood it at the time. A sealed burgundy file had arrived at Windsor just after 9 in the morning. No public announcement. No ceremonial courier. Just a senior solicitor carrying a narrow leather case that had once belonged to Queen Elizabeth II's private legal office. The solicitor asked for Charles. He was told the king's schedule was full. He asked for William. William was in Cornwall. Then he said something that immediately changed the mood. "The review period expires at noon on Friday." The private secretary stared at him. "What review period?" The solicitor didn't answer directly. He placed the leather case on the desk and slid a cream envelope across the polished surface. On the front were 4 handwritten words: "For the family council only." Inside was a legal instruction dated 1996. That date mattered, but the name at the bottom mattered more. Elizabeth R. The late Queen had apparently created a private arrangement concerning a royal property reserve, a collection of personal archives, and an annual income fund that had never appeared in the public sovereign grant accounts. This wasn't crown property. It wasn't government money. It was private family business, which meant Charles could delay it without Parliament asking questions. At least, that was what he believed. The arrangement required the reigning monarch to confirm a permanent custodian after the Queen's death. Not an owner, a custodian. Someone trusted to protect the property, manage the archive, supervise its income, and decide which members of the family could use it. Charles had been given 12 months to confirm that person. He waited. The deadline was extended. He waited again. Then came the sentence Charles apparently hadn't expected anyone else to discover. If the sovereign declined to act after the final review date, authority would pass to the senior next-generation family representative named by the trust's continuity provision. Not William. Catherine. Wait, what? That was the first contradiction. William was the heir. Charles was the king. But Catherine had been quietly added to the continuity provision after her marriage because the late Queen wanted one future senior royal who wasn't trapped inside the direct father-to-son struggle. Someone close enough to understand the monarchy, but separate enough to make a decision without protecting her own inheritance. Charles had known about the deadline. What he hadn't known was that the final extension had already been used. Or perhaps he knew and believed nobody would enforce it. That question became dangerous when Camilla learned what was inside the file. She didn't learn it from Charles. She learned it because one of her private aides saw the solicitor leaving the castle and asked the wrong person the right question. By lunchtime, Camilla knew 3 things. The trust existed. Catherine could activate it. But nobody would tell her who the late Queen had named as preferred custodian. That silence terrified her more than any answer could have. Because Camilla had spent years watching how the family reacted whenever Queen Elizabeth's private wishes resurfaced. Anne became immovable. William became cold. Edward stopped speaking altogether. But Catherine listened. Then she remembered everything. At 4:20 that afternoon, Camilla entered Charles's study, carrying no papers and asking no permission. The door closed behind her. Staff outside couldn't hear every word, but they heard enough. "You said this was settled," Charles answered quietly. "I said it was being handled. That is not the same thing." "No, it isn't." Then, nothing. 5 full seconds of silence. When Camilla came out, she wasn't shouting. That made it worse. She walked past the equerry, reached the corridor, then turned back toward the closed door. Friday is not happening. But Friday was already coming, and Catherine had just received a handwritten note from Princess Anne. It contained one line: "Ask why Edward refused Wood Farm." That looked meaningless. When the fighting ended, millions were dead. Wood Farm had been closely associated with Prince Philip during his retirement. Edward understood its private significance better than almost anyone. In this dramatized scenario, he had once been offered a formal role connected to the family estate arrangements. He declined, not because the responsibility was too small, because accepting it would have revealed the existence of the larger trust. Edward had kept quiet for years. That silence made him look irrelevant. But it had actually protected his claim. Catherine called him that evening. The conversation lasted 7 minutes. Edward reportedly gave her no argument, no demand, and no grand speech. He simply said, "My mother wanted it preserved, not divided." Catherine asked the obvious question, "Why didn't you tell Charles?" Edward paused. Then came the answer that turned a legal disagreement into a family betrayal. "I did." So Charles hadn't overlooked Edward. He had heard him. He had seen the late Queen's preference. But he still refused to complete the decision. Why? The answer was buried in a second document, one Charles believed had been removed from the active file. It hadn't been removed. It had been copied. Princess Anne had the copy. The next morning, Anne arrived at Adelaide Cottage before 8. No photographers. No palace car displaying a royal standard. She came through the side entrance carrying a plain black folder. Catherine poured tea. Anne didn't touch it. She opened the folder and showed Catherine a page containing 3 handwritten names: Edward, Anne, Charles. Each name had a notation beside it. Beside Anne, operational authority. Beside Charles, sovereign confirmation. Beside Edward, permanent stewardship. The late Queen had separated the powers deliberately. Anne would make sure the arrangement was followed. Charles would formally approve it. Edward would inherit responsibility for it. Not the castle, not a title, something much more uncomfortable: control. Edward would decide who gained access to the private archive, who could use the property, how its income was distributed, and whether future requests from extended family members were approved or rejected. That included requests connected to Camilla's side of the family. Suddenly, Charles's delay made sense. Confirming Edward would strengthen the one brother who had never publicly challenged him, but it would also place a private royal resource beyond the influence of Charles's household. Charles hadn't rejected the decision. He had frozen it. There was only one problem. Freezing it had triggered Catherine's authority. And Anne had known that from the beginning. That's the moment you probably think Catherine signed immediately. She didn't. She waited. Not because she was frightened of Camilla, because the document contained one final blank space: reason for activation. Whatever Catherine wrote there would become part of the family record. One sentence: permanent. Charles could delay in private, but Catherine's reason would explain publicly, at least within future royal archives, why she acted against the king's preference. What would you write? Failure to act? Conflict of interest? Protection of the late Queen's wishes? Catherine chose none of them. She wrote 5 words: to prevent permanent family division. That sentence reached Charles before dinner. His reaction wasn't anger. It was fear, because Catherine hadn't accused him of breaking the trust. She had implied his delay was already tearing the family apart. But Charles still had one move left. He summoned William. The meeting took place after 9 that night. Charles expected his son to stop Catherine. That was the assumption inside Camilla's circle. William would protect the hierarchy. William would tell his wife that only the king could settle a royal family dispute. William entered the room alone. Charles placed the document between them. "Your wife is exceeding her position." William read Catherine's sentence. Then he looked at the unsigned approval line. "No," he said, "she's fulfilling it." Charles pushed the file away. "You don't understand what Edward will control." William's reply landed like a blade. "I understand exactly why grandmother chose him." That was the second betrayal. At least, it felt like betrayal to Charles. William wasn't choosing Catherine over his father. He was choosing the late queen's written decision over the king's silence. But Camilla saw it differently. To her, the lines had been drawn. Anne had found the documents. Edward held the hidden claim. Catherine had the temporary authority. William had decided not to stop her. 4 royals, one side, Charles standing in the middle. But Camilla still believed she could break them apart. Her opportunity came the following morning when she requested a private conversation with Catherine. No Anne, no William, no advisors, just the 2 women. Camilla arrived calm, almost warm. She told Catherine that activating the trust could humiliate Charles. Catherine said nothing. Camilla warned that Edward might not understand the financial weight of the role. Still nothing. Then she made the mistake. She mentioned a request that had never been publicly discussed. A future application for use of one of the trust properties by members of Camilla's family. Catherine's expression changed. "How do you know the trust owns that property?" Camilla froze. Because the list of properties was sealed. Even Catherine had only seen it the previous day. Camilla tried to recover. She said Charles had mentioned it casually. But Charles later denied ever giving her the list. So who had? That question pulled the entire dispute in a new direction. Because somebody inside the legal review process had been quietly sharing details before Catherine received the file. Someone believed Charles would keep delaying until the arrangement could be rewritten, but the trust could not be rewritten without the consent of all 3 original branches named in the document. Charles's branch, Anne's branch, Edward's branch. Anne would never agree. Edward had never been asked, which meant the delay wasn't creating time for negotiation. It was creating time for pressure. Pressure on whom? Edward. This is where the story stops being a disagreement and becomes something much uglier. If you enjoy royal stories where one hidden document changes everything, subscribe now, because the next move exposed why Edward had remained so quiet for so long. Catherine asked Edward to come to Windsor. He refused, not rudely. He said he would attend only if Sophie came with him. Camilla objected immediately. She claimed Sophie had no formal role in the trust. When the fighting ended, millions were dead. Neither do you. That one sentence ended the discussion. Edward and Sophie arrived shortly before noon on Friday. The deadline was 3 hours away. Charles was already inside. Camilla sat beside him. William stood near the window. Anne had placed the original continuity papers at the center of the table. Catherine entered last. She carried the activation page, still unsigned. For the first 10 minutes, nobody raised their voice. Charles argued that the monarchy was going through a delicate transition. Edward's appointment could wait. Anne reminded him the deadline had already been extended twice. Camilla asked whether the Queen had fully understood how much control she was transferring. Edward finally looked at her. She understood everything. Camilla turned to Charles. "You cannot allow this." Charles didn't answer. Because he could no longer allow or prevent it. Catherine could. But then Catherine did something nobody in the room had planned for. She pushed the document toward Edward. "Before I sign this, I need the truth." Edward looked down. What truth? Why did the king delay? Everyone expected Charles to interrupt. He didn't. Edward slowly opened the small case Sophie had carried into the room. Inside was a letter. Not from the Queen, from Charles, dated 6 months earlier. The letter asked Edward to voluntarily withdraw from consideration as permanent steward. In exchange, Charles offered him another ceremonial family position. No property authority, no income supervision, no archive access, a title without power. Edward had declined. But he never exposed the offer. Why? Because he thought Charles would eventually do the right thing. That belief had cost him 6 months. Catherine read the letter twice. William didn't need to. The first line was enough. Anne stared at Charles with the expression he had feared since the file resurfaced. Not rage, disappointment. Camilla insisted the letter proved nothing improper. Charles was free to propose another arrangement. That was technically true, but Catherine noticed something hidden in the final paragraph. Charles had described Edward's stewardship as temporary. The Queen's document said permanent. That wasn't a small difference. It meant Charles had been trying to convince Edward to surrender something Edward didn't know could never later be restored. Once he withdrew, the trust would pass to the alternative branch. Which branch? That name had been redacted from Edward's copy. Anne's copy wasn't redacted. Catherine turned the page. The alternative branch was Charles himself. Not William, not Anne, Charles. If Edward withdrew, the king would gain the stewardship automatically and could appoint future administrators from his own household. Now Camilla's anger made sense. She wasn't furious because Catherine had interrupted a normal decision. She was furious because Catherine had stopped the delay seconds before it could produce the result Charles wanted. Charles had waited for Edward to give up. Edward hadn't. Catherine's authority activated. The trap closed on the wrong person. Still, Catherine didn't sign. Not yet. She asked Charles one final question. Did you intend to tell Edward that withdrawing would make the transfer irreversible? Charles looked at his brother, then at the letter. His answer came out quietly. I intended to find another solution. That wasn't an answer. Everyone knew it, especially Edward. For the first time, Edward's composure broke. Not with shouting. That would have been easier. He leaned back and said, You were waiting for me to disappear from it. Charles denied that. Edward nodded toward the unsigned page. Then tell her not to sign. The room stopped. Because Charles couldn't. The legal deadline was minutes away. He could ask. He could plead. But after months of refusing to act, he no longer had the authority to command. Camilla stepped in. She told Catherine she would be remembered as the woman who publicly undermined a reigning king. Catherine finally looked directly at her. No, I'll be remembered as the person who ended the waiting. Then she signed. One stroke. No ceremony. No applause. But that signature did 4 things immediately. It confirmed Edward as permanent steward. It placed operational oversight with Anne. It removed the trust from Charles's private household control. But the 4th consequence was the one Camilla hadn't seen coming. Every pending application involving the trust was canceled, including the future property request linked to members of her family. Canceled, not rejected, which meant it could be submitted again, but only to Edward, the man everyone assumed had no power. The brother Charles expected to step aside. The royal Camilla had barely spoken to throughout the entire dispute. She turned toward him. Edward closed the file. Camilla asked whether he intended to reconsider the application. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He simply repeated the words his mother had apparently used when she entrusted him with the responsibility. It will be preserved, not divided. Camilla stood so quickly her chair scraped across the floor. She accused Catherine of turning the family against the king. Anne replied that the family had been waiting for the king to act. William said nothing. He didn't need to. Catherine's signature was already drying. But Charles was still staring at Edward's letter. Perhaps he finally understood what the delay had cost him. He hadn't just lost control of a private royal trust. He had shown his youngest brother exactly how little his patience had been valued. Camilla left first. Charles remained seated. Anne collected the original papers. Sophie placed her hand on Edward's shoulder. Catherine moved toward the door, but Edward called her back. He asked why she had taken the risk. Why she had signed when Charles, Camilla, and half the palace would accuse her of crossing a line. Catherine looked at the empty approval space where Charles's name should have been. Then she said the one thing nobody in that room could argue with. Because your mother already decided. That was the real humiliation. Catherine hadn't seized the Queen's power. She had enforced it. Charles hadn't been defeated by his daughter-in-law. He had been defeated by a decision his own mother made years before he became king, then left behind because she suspected one day he might hesitate. Edward walked out carrying the burgundy file. Anne walked beside him. William followed Catherine. Charles remained at the table, with Camilla's empty chair beside him. But the image that stayed with everyone wasn't the signature. It wasn't the argument. It was the final page Catherine left open beneath the palace lights. One name printed at the top. Prince Edward. One word printed underneath. Permanent. Tell me in the comments whether Catherine protected the late Queen's wishes or crossed a line even a future queen should never cross.